Morning all. It's Thursday the 16th, the day of our last A-level business exam. So wishing you all the best this afternoon. And as we've done with paper 1 and paper 2, we thought we'd just have a gentle warm-up just before the exam begins in a few hours' time. An opportunity to perhaps recap one or two of the main topic areas, perhaps a model or two that you're not quite sure about, perhaps something, maybe linking some topics, maybe thinking about some examples you could use in the open question 6. But also just a chance to recap what to expect in paper 3 in terms of structure. So very gentle. Fortunately, we haven't got lots of calculations to do in paper 3. Anyway, not calculations you get set. There are some calculations you could do. And also don't forget, if you get a chance, if you've not already joined us, last night we did a big paper 3 walkthrough on the Fitness Island case study. So that is available to watch if you wish. I've put timestamps on that replay to help you go to the bit that might be useful for you. And also, don't forget, the night before we did a revision blast on quite a few of the topic areas that I think are quite likely to appear. Can't guarantee we'll get the same result as we did for paper 2, but we're doing our best to try to help spot stuff that might come up. No guarantees though. Been looking through the live chat, lots and lots of people asking for certain topic areas to cover, so I've picked out as many of those as possible, and we'll also just keep doing the Q&A as we go. So I'll put questions on the screen. I'll start off with the most common topics that have come up after just doing a quick recap on paper 3, which is going to be around organisational culture, which is a big part, I think, likely to be a big part of this afternoon, as well as innovation. I'll link the two together. We'll look at Greiner's model of growth as part of 3.10, and then also touch on sources of finance. But we'll cover anything you want to cover. But I thought those are the ones that most people have been asking for. And how long is a session? Lots of people asking. Well, the last time we did this, it was 2 hours long. Hopefully we'll finish before the exam starts, but normally we try to go for about an hour and a half, depending on how many questions there are. But the intention is not to go all the way through to before the exam starts. It's just to help answer questions, really. So if it's all right with you, I'll keep an eye on the live chat. I'll just quickly maybe do 5 minutes or so on paper 3 structure, a bit of advice on how to tackle the paper. It's not the only way to tackle the paper, but it kind of works. So I've graded out paper 1 and 2 because you've done those. They're nailed. They're being marked now, and I'm sure you've done well on those. But paper 3, slightly different challenge. So there are no short answer questions, no short calculations. Well, there haven't been historically, so no reason why there should be. No MCQs. What you've got are 6 response questions. They're not essays as such. Don't think of these as 6 essays. That makes it more daunting. They're simply 6 questions based on the case study. Question 6 obviously is an open question, so we'll talk briefly about that. But basically all 6 questions are based on the case study, and all you need to do is unpick the questions, respond, use the case study as much as possible. And don't forget, for 4 of those questions, that's questions 3, 4, 5 and 6, you will need evaluation. So you don't need any evaluation. You don't need a conclusion for questions 1 and 2. 12 marks. It's just analysis, application and demonstrating your knowledge and understanding. But questions 3, 4, 5 and 6 all need a conclusion, need a judgment. So that's why paper 3 is quite a challenge, because you're not sort of getting up to speed and gaining some minutes with quick fire calculations or short answer questions, and therefore time management is critical. However, the key to success in paper 3 is to keep doing what you've been doing in paper 1 and paper 2, which is simply to read the question, unpick the question and give a response that meets the demands of the question. So the same rules apply in terms of effective and efficient writing in paper 3. Writing answers that are focused relentlessly on the question and nothing else. Not drifting, not trying to write page after page after page. That is the key to success. And as a consequence of that, you're more likely not to do what quite a few students have done historically in paper 3, which is run out of time. For example, not even getting to question 6, which is a nightmare. I mean, it shouldn't happen. But it does happen if you allow yourself to drift from the question and write too much, particularly for the 12 markers and the 16 markers. So absolutely critical that you are really strict with your time. You've got 2 tasks, haven't you? One is to read the case study and the appendices, and we'll just talk about that briefly. But then you need to get into those 12 markers. And I would do the questions in the order that they are presented, because the more that you get into the case study, the more you refer back to it and think about the case study, the easier the later questions become. So the main thing is not to overrun on those 12 markers. So time management is critical. And the other difference here, the difference I think in paper 3 that really makes the difference when it comes to marks, is application. Paper 3 is the only paper where all the answers are given to you at the start of the exam. They're given to you in a thing called the insert, which is the case study. The 2 pages or so, 1.5, 2 pages of text, usually with 5 or 6 mini sections in it, explaining about the business, the story, what's happened, what the future holds, and then the appendices, 3, 4, possibly 5 appendices, maybe some qualitative data, maybe some quantitative data in a chart or a table. But the answers to all 6 questions are in the case study. So if you just focus on applying the case study to all of your arguments, you will seriously impress the examiner, because too many students in paper 3 treat it as a data ignore paper, not a data response paper, and just write vanilla application, vanilla analysis with no reference to the case study other than just writing out bits of the case study. So it is all about application. All about application. Anshia, I've seen your question about question 6 last night, so we'll go through that. I'll go through that. So I've seen your question on that one. And then the other thing to say is, because 4 of the 6 questions have evaluation as a requirement, so the 2 16 markers, the 20 marker and the 24 marker, evaluation is the highest weighted skill of all the 3 papers. This is the paper that weights evaluation the highest. Therefore, you need to make sure you allow enough time in each of those 4 questions, questions 3, 4, 5 and 6, to write a fully justified conclusion, including some extra application, because you should apply it throughout your response, not just in the arguments. Evaluate as you go if you can. Not you don't have to, but it's a good thing to do. But please make sure that you get those evaluations down in those 4 questions, because it makes a massive difference to the overall quality and marks of your responses. Yeah, so there we go. That was just, and we went through that last night. So apologies if that's a reminder from to those of you who joined us last night, because I thought I wanted us to mention those again. Lots of people asking about what might we get this afternoon in terms of ratios, calculations, and that kind of stuff. Well, there is a pretty significant clue in the advanced information. So firstly, QS1 and QS2 and 3 are examinable this afternoon. So you could be asked, you won't be asked, but I think it's unusual to be given a calculation question, but you could be given information in an appendix, and it's basically an invitation to calculate ratios, averages and fractions, and percentage changes, and also to interpret graphical forms. So for example, network analysis is examinable this afternoon, and you won't be asked to complete a network diagram, but you could be asked, like we did last night, to interpret a completed network analysis and consider the implications of perhaps a delay in one of the activities. And the classic example is an activity that wasn't previously on the critical path that gets delayed, that therefore changes the duration of the project and the critical path. So interpreting that data will be QS3. In terms of ratios, 3.7.5 is it? I think. Anyway, 3.7. Most of the financial ratios are not examinable this afternoon, so no return on capital employed, no gearing, no efficiency ratios, no liquidity ratios. However, from year 12, profitability ratios are examinable. So your gross profit calculation, gross profit margin, operating profit margin, profit for the year. I wouldn't be surprised, as we saw last night in the Fitness Island case study, to see a table of financial information which might enable you to calculate operating profit, for example, or gross profits, possibly a profitability margin, perhaps a percentage change in sales turnover. So I think profitability ratios, other than return on capital employed, which isn't examinable, could easily feature. So you need to be on top of those. But other than that, really, the rest of the ratios don't come into play. They shouldn't do this afternoon. QS8 is examinable. That's no surprise there. That's often the case in paper 3. It's about making decisions. So the classic question comes in 2 forms, and it's often, not exclusively, but often question 5, which is the 20 marker. It doesn't have to be. It's either they've made a decision, the case study business has made a decision. Do you think it was the right decision? Do you think it was a good decision? Yes or no? And obviously you need a balanced answer. Or it could be, which options should they choose? So last night we looked at, should they accept a venture capital investment, new share capital, or should they take a higher bank loan out? That would be a classic QS8 to make a decision. But that doesn't necessarily have to be financial related. It could be anything, couldn't it? That's based around a decision, and then using the data to help inform the decision. So hopefully that's useful in terms of the advanced information quantitative skills. I just wanted to put those on there. And the only thing I just wanted to mention, lots of people have been asking about question 6, the 24 marker. So is it the same structure as the 16 mark open questions in paper 2? Well, we had 2 of them, didn't we? And the answer, I think, is yes. It is the same structure. Now, what's the difference between a 16 marker and 24 marks? Well, 8 marks. So therefore, you've got slightly longer to develop your arguments and your conclusion. If you've got time, don't forget question 6, the 24 marker, right at the end, you may be pressed for time, in which case, if you know that the 16 mark approach, which I've put on the screen here, works, apply it, use it. Because it may well be you've only got 20 minutes to do question 6, so use it. And it's just as effective as any other structure, probably more effective. The only tweak I would make to this, if you have time, is in the argument 4. We're going to use the case study business to say it is the case in the case of the case study business. We definitely want to do that anyway. You could potentially just spend a minute or 2 bringing in some other situations, examples where it might also be the case in addition to the case study business. But the other side of it, the argument against, this is where you bring in your other examples from other businesses, other industries, other contexts. That's just the same. And then the conclusion, you've just got a little bit longer to explore how in some situations it is the case and in some situations it isn't the case. So there we go. Hopefully that's useful in terms of question 6. So let's, before we go into looking at some specifics, just let me check what else I've got on the screen here. So I've got all kinds of files open here. A number of people have asked about peak and pi. So let's just quickly remind you about that. So peak and pi is just an approach to writing effective points. I'm sure it's familiar to lots of you, but if it's not, a quick reminder: for 12 marks, question 1 and question 2, there is no requirement to evaluate at all, not either in the paragraph or with a conclusion. However, for 16 marks and above, you can evaluate as you go. But in every question, you're going to want to write well-developed points that are well analysed, but most importantly, in context, using the case study. That's the idea of a pecan. So don't forget, we always state the point we're going to argue. We write a full stop. We don't use any application from the case study in that first sentence. Otherwise, the application becomes the point and it's no longer application. We then explain how and why that point is relevant. And most importantly, we apply that point, drawing from the case study. It's absolutely vital that we use the case study as much as possible. For 16 marks and above, if you wish, you can write an evaluation sentence that maybe comments on the strength of that point, or perhaps develops an it depends on point for that point. It's not a conclusion, but it is evaluating as you go. Jessica's saying, so we don't have to evaluate on a 12 marker. Correct. There's no evaluation marks for the 12 markers. So therefore, no need for any evaluation in the point or the points, and no conclusion. So that's a good example of how, if you thought there was evaluation, you could easily get dragged down into writing too much for a 12 marker. That's why do the 12 markers first. There's no evaluation. Then you can move on to the questions that do have it, which is questions 3, 4, and 5. Okay, so one, two questions coming into the live chat that aren't connected with paper 3. No surprise there, though, because we're almost there, aren't we? We're almost there. Just a quick word about applications. So I know we mentioned this last night, but quite a few of you maybe not yet seen that, or couldn't be bothered to turn up last night, or I've forgotten all about what application is. I noticed in the live chat a number of people said, I just write out what's in the case study. Well, that's called writing out what's in the case study. That's not application. So application is using the information in the case study. And we said already this morning that the answers are given to you when you walk into the exam. It's the case study. So the question is, how do you use that information? Paddles is worth writing down maybe somewhere when you get in there, because it's quite a nice acronym just to remember to try to draw from the case study as often as you can. So P is for patterns. Let's say, for example, you get a chart in the appendix. Does it show a trend? Is it a sales chart? Is there a trend there? Could you discern what that trend is? Well, if you can, use that and say the chart in Appendix C shows a trend of declining sales or increasing profits or whatever it is. Is there anything in the data that looks odd or out of place or unusual, perhaps a significant change? Perhaps all of a sudden a loss rather than a profit if they were giving you operating profit and loss information. Is there anything unusual? Because usually the examiner will try to put into the data something which they want you to use. They're there to try to help you answer these questions. So it'll often be something either in the tables, the appendices, or in the text in the 2 pages. Next, data manipulation. Can you draw out something from the data? Can you do a calculation, as we did last night, to then apply in your answer? Because data manipulation is a highly effective way of showing application. So let's say, for example, sales last year were 10 million, this year 15 million. Data manipulation would be sales have increased by 5 million or 50%. And if I applied that and used that in my argument, that is application. That's instantly raising the quality of my response for the examiner. Also, can you link data together? Is there some data, I don't know, on innovation that might be linked to, I don't know, organizational culture? Are there any limitations in the data? But also, don't forget, how do you use the data to support your argument? So be thinking in every argument, I want to refer to the case study situation or the data at least twice in each argument to make sure that I am applying the case study to my points. Also, don't forget, in your conclusions, you should add some application in. You should apply throughout your response, not just in your arguments. There we go. So, there we go. I was just lining up a few bits and bobs on models and theories. So I think we're going to go on to, let's come back to the screen here. Let's start to pick out some stuff. I'm pretty sure early doors we've had quite a few people saying, could we quickly do Hofstede and Handy? So is that a handy place to start, do you think? Should we do organizational culture? What do you think? Let's do a bit of, let me get it lined up for you. You can tell I've spent a long time preparing this, can't you? Let's quickly go through organizational culture. And we'll start with Handy's model, and then we'll do with Hofstede, and then we'll also touch on the other bits in organizational culture. Now, organizational culture wasn't examinable in paper 1. It wasn't examinable in paper 2, but it definitely is today. And the reason why I think it's going to be quite a big feature of this afternoon is that also innovation, which is part of 3.9, innovation is also examinable, and the two often go close together, are often seen as part of two sides of the same coin. So I can easily see a situation where there's something in the case study where there is either a problem with the organizational culture, it's not innovative enough, and for whatever reason, maybe a new leader wants to create a more innovative organizational culture. That could easily be part of a question or part of a situation that you could draw on, or it could just be a new leader wanting to come in and change the culture, and one possible consequence of that would be an improvement in the business's ability to innovate. So organizational culture, we need to be on top of the two models of culture. So Handy, I would say, is 80%. If Hofstede was 20%, I'd say Handy was 80% likely to be used. But you need to be ready for both. The reason I say that is Hofstede's model is mainly associated with research into different cultures in different countries, national cultures. It can be manipulated to be applied to situations where two businesses have different cultures. But that's a bit of a stretch. And the reason why I think Hofstede, whilst it could come up, I think it's less likely, is because there's no trading in international markets, which I think is 3.9.1, something like that, isn't examinable this year. So, remember Bartlett and Goshal and all that kind of stuff. That's where Hofstede really comes in handy. Sorry, I'm using handy twice. It comes in useful. I think Handy's model is more likely, and it's a simpler model for the examiner to use as perhaps as part of the case study. So Handy's model, really, it's simple, isn't it? There are 4 different types of culture. The power culture is all about power being held at the centre. An organisational culture where the boss is in charge. Often the founder. Often that's a culture that applies in a small, young business where the founder is the leader and probably does too much. But it can also be sustained in a business that grows big and complex, but where the founder has an overwhelming influence on the business. And I can think of businesses like Sports Direct, where, although he's now left, the founder, Mike Ashley, very much influenced the culture. That was undoubtedly a power culture that he built and into an incredibly successful business. Power cultures may work in some situations. Typically, though, businesses that are more stable, probably a bit more mature, more complex, better run, you might argue, tend to have what's known as a role culture. So the main contrast is between power and role. And role culture is where there is an organisational hierarchy. Roles and responsibilities are well defined. Managers are in charge of functions. There is a chain of command. A flat or tall hierarchy, but there is a hierarchy. It's well understood who does what and why. Good controls, all that kind of stuff. And actually, a role culture is I would say, the culture in the vast majority of well-established businesses. And it serves them well. It serves most businesses well. The danger with the role culture is that you've got this potential for what's known as silo mentality, which is that, the marketing department don't talk to the operations department, and the HR department don't talk to the operations department. So that's a danger. It's not that much of a risk in most businesses. Task culture is all about a culture where people just are responsible for their work, their tasks. Often where you're bringing people in to do specific tasks. And the culture is all about completing the task and being rewarded for completing the task. Person culture is more associated with service businesses, in particular where you've got professional services, specialists, and it's all about individualistic approaches to culture. So hopefully that explains what those different types of culture are. I think the classic paper 3 question, and just let me get Hofstede lined up. The classic paper 3 question would be where there is a change in culture that's required. And as we saw with the Fitness Island, the new CEO, Gemma, wanted to change Jacques' power culture into a role culture. And there were some consequences of that, some benefits, hopefully, for the business. Now, let's just briefly touch on Hofstede, and then we'll also talk about how this all links to innovation. So good old Hofstede, if I can find him, Gert Hofstede, the Hofstede Institute, still doing research as we speak into the differences in national cultures. Basically, the Hofstede model is that the research has identified different types of culture depending on where businesses are located. So it's a model of national cultures. And what the Hofstede Institute did was identified a series of dimensions where you could create an index. Low number, high number, 0 to 100. And depending on what dimension they were looking at, certain types of countries tend to have low numbers, certain types of countries tend to have high. So to give you an example, the dimension of masculinity versus femininity. Masculinity is about business cultures where it's all about achievement and, recognition of effort and get on with it. A sales culture would be a great example of that, wouldn't it? Individualistic achievement, tough it out, get on with it. Yeah, that's often the case in some businesses and some cultures. The feminine approach, according to Hofstede, would be more about team, more about how people are treated by an organisation. That's the culture that is more dominant. Whereas in a masculine culture, it's all about getting on with it, performance, rewarding the top flyers, all that kind of stuff. Another one would be short-term, long-term. So cultures that just focus on the short-term performance this week, next year, targets. Whereas maybe long-term takes a slightly different approach to risk, sees things longer term in terms of how individuals get rewarded or how teams get rewarded. So that's really what Hofstede's culture did. Now, how does it apply in a possible case study this afternoon? Well, I think with Hofstede and with Handy, I think the most likely scenario is, as I've mentioned, a new leader's come in, wants to change the culture. I think another scenario could be there's been some kind of takeover, some kind of bringing together of two businesses, and there is a clash of cultures. Maybe, let's say it's a takeover situation, and the business that has been bought has a different culture. Maybe it has a role culture, not a power culture, or it has a masculine culture rather than a feminine culture. So I think that will be the thing to look out for in terms of applying Hofstede's model. A clash of cultures is typically how this might be used as part of the question. Does that help in terms of Hofstede and Handy? Any questions on that? What do we think? And a general call for decorum, please, on the live chat as well. I'm absolutely not going to tolerate any kind of bullying or any kind of nonsense like that, because we've got a big exam coming up. So how about one or two of the lads just grow up for the next hour or so, if you don't mind. So that's Handy and Hofstede. hopefully that's useful. Shall we just touch on innovation? A number of people have asked about innovation. Well, innovation is, let me turn to it in the AI. Oh yeah, 3.9.2. So again, assessing innovation wasn't examined, couldn't be examined in paper 1 or 2, is examinable, will be examined, it will be examined this afternoon. No doubt at all about it, because it's all in there. Now, there are different parts of innovation. As we did in the revision live stream, one important thing to look out for is the difference between product innovation and process innovation. So product innovation might link quite nicely to new product development, which is also examinable in the marketing mix. So one part of the marketing mix is the influences on new product development. Well, you could link that to, does the business have a culture of innovation when it comes to product innovation? So I think that's one way it could appear. Product innovation, it's from the customer's point of view. They see, they enjoy, they benefit from improvements in a product. Could be the way a product is delivered as a service. It could be something tangible, features on a good of some sort. So product innovation is from a customer point of view. It's about improved product performance and features. So it links nicely with new product development. Process innovation could be the other side of this. Now, process innovation is slightly different. It's about the way a business is organized in order to mainly to reduce unit costs and to be more efficient. So it could be that we're not looking at new products, we're looking at ways of a culture that tries to find ways of doing things better, which is why it links really nicely to one of the hot topics that's not yet been examined in the first 5 years, Kaizen. Kaizen. So let's just spend a minute on Kaizen. Kaizen is part of innovation, but Kaizen in particular is associated with process innovation. Kaizen originates from, mainly from the Japanese manufacturing renaissance in the 1960s and 70s. And essentially, it's an organizational culture. Kaizen is a culture. Okay, I know it's in innovation in the specification, but really it's organizational culture. And what Kaizen is a concept, a culture of making many, many small changes in order to improve efficiency and quality. But a culture where employees are empowered to make those changes so that they don't need to seek permission. They simply work together, and that's why it's often associated with quality circles, albeit quality isn't examinable. But Kaizen is this idea of everyone in the organization always looking for ways to improve the way things are done. And that is process innovation. So businesses that apply Kaizen, constantly looking to do things better, tend to be very innovative. They also tend to be very efficient, which links to competitiveness, doesn't it, as well? So I think those are the two things to look out for in terms of innovation. I think it's quite likely that innovation could be described by the examiner in the context of organizational culture. Maybe the new leader wants the business to be more innovative. Well, ask yourself, what kind of innovation do they want? Do they want more product innovation, i.e. new products, better products, maybe products that are more competitive, because that might be part of the marketing mix, also examinable, or is it that they want the business to become more efficient, more effective, and the processes of the businesses to become more innovative? And how do you do that? So it links to two other terms which are in innovation, which you need to know about. So hopefully you do. One of which is a concept called entrepreneurship. Entrepreneurship is part of innovation. Entrepreneurship was examined in 2018, appallingly answered, because most students didn't know what it was. So we covered it 2 nights ago. Entrepreneurship is allowing employees in an organization to be entrepreneurial. So inside entrepreneurship equals entrepreneurship. And what it is, it's where you allow employees to have time off or to work on their own projects in work time that interest them, that might be useful, that might have some commercial benefit to the business. And it's actively encouraged, it's championed, it's rewarded, is entrepreneurial activity. 2 classic examples of that. The Sony PlayStation was launched as a consequence of entrepreneurship, people being allowed to go develop models, prototypes, concepts. So too post-it notes and a variety of other products. So entrepreneurship, if that turns up, think of that in terms of innovation. The other one, which might come up, and again, it's not been examined. No, it's not been examined. Could come up a concept called benchmarking. So we've done entrepreneurship, benchmarking, not yet been examined, like Kaizen, part of innovation. So benchmarking is where you compare your performance with those of a relevant average or competitor. So, for example, you might look at measures of innovation, how many new products you launch per year compared with the industry average, that kind of measure. So benchmarking is a means of measuring your performance compared with the competition or compared with the industry average. And what benchmarking might do is enable you to spot areas where you need to improve or where you've got an advantage. But typically, if you're going to be given some benchmarking data, look carefully for where the business is underperforming compared with the average. The only other part of innovation that could be examined, and I think it's a slightly more niche one, but could be, is around how do you protect innovation. And the only two things you need to know are around patents and copyright. Those are the only two methods of protecting innovation that are mentioned in the specification. Obviously, patents are all about a process as well as products. Quite hard to get, but very, very valuable. Copyright is automatically granted to any business, but you have to protect it. You have to claim where there's a breach of copyright. So that's innovation. Any questions on innovation? So I've sort of rambled on there, but I know quite a few people were asking me to recap innovation for 5 minutes. What do we think? How's that? Trademarks, you can mention RIA for sure. It's not in the specification, but it is another method of protecting innovation. And in particular with trademarks, of course, you link that to branding. So branding your name, your logo, and any other image or media that is associated with your brand is trademarked. But as Paul and others have mentioned, the only two specific measures of protecting innovation are patents and copyright. So I think with innovation and organisational culture, we've covered two big areas there. I can see them being examined together. I can see that, but we'll have to see if they come. Well, they will come up, but how they'll come up. Now, the other thing to mention is, I know we did cover this 2 nights ago. Don't forget, with organisational culture, we've got a couple of models, Handy and Hofstadter, which might be useful. But also, it could be that we're asked to consider why organisational culture is being changed, or why it needs to change, and the possible implications of change. So don't forget, change management is not examinable. So we don't need Lewin and Cotter and Schlesinger. However, organisational cultural change is. So the reasons why organisational cultures might be changed, for example, poor financial performance or new leadership, as well as the implications and also the problems, the challenges that might be faced when changing culture. Okay, there we go. So hopefully that's useful. I think we've covered organisational culture and innovation. What should we do next? Do you want to cover Greiner's growth model next? What do we think? Or do you want to do sources of finance? Just made a list here of all the things that people have been asking for before and during the live stream. And network analysis as well to come up. Yeah. Devon's asked a question about, let's stick one or two of these questions on the screen here as we go. So apologies if I don't get all of your questions on screen, but it's a good question just relating to innovation there. Would it be in the case of whether a business would want to be more process or product innovative? Yeah, it should be, shouldn't it? There should be something in the narrative that explains what the objective is, and there could be some evidence as to perhaps whether it's innovative or not, but it should tell you. Yeah, it should tell you. Any more questions about innovation as well as what on that topic? Oh, it's a great point by Ethan here, which actually we're going to come on to because we're going to spend a few minutes on good old Greiner's model. You could link power culture to the leadership crisis. Absolutely, you could, and we saw this yesterday, didn't we? In the Fitness Island case study, where you had a young founder, as it turned out, very much at the centre of the business, in charge of the business, doing everything, finding it hard to let go. That is the classic leadership crisis in Greiner. A young business that needs control, needs better direction. It's the first crisis that Greiner identified, and therefore often it's trying to turn a power culture into a more suitable culture for the size and complexity of the business, which tends to be a role culture. What else have we got? Hayes is asking, is entrepreneurship for product innovation? It doesn't have to be, no. Entrepreneurship could be both. So entrepreneurship is this idea of encouraging employees to be entrepreneurial. Well, you could be encouraging them to find more efficient ways of doing things, better ways of doing things. They might identify product improvements that could be features of a product, which would be product innovation, but it might also be ways that we make the product. That will be process innovation. So it can be both. It's often associated, though, with product innovation. Entrepreneurship is often associated with new product ideas that come out that the business can sell. But it can be both. It can be both. What else have we got here? Sophie is asking, could there be a big mark question on innovation? Yeah, there could be. Could be. Yeah. In particular in relation to organisational culture. It could be a 16 marker. Maybe the case study business has decided to invest significantly in new product development by trying to be more entrepreneurial. And the question is, is that a good idea? Evaluation question. So absolutely, that could be a question. Trend Gaming has asked lots of questions in all our live streams. Great to see you again. Can you refer to Kaizen as an organisational culture in the exam? Yeah. I mean, Kaizen is an approach to organisational culture. It absolutely is. It's associated as well with quality, but it's quality and innovation. It's a cultural approach to innovation. So absolutely, you could mention that, or you could use that in the exam. And of course, if Kaizen was mentioned in the case study, then we know what it is now, don't we? It's this idea of trying to do things better. Which can be, it's not easy to do, not easy to get the whole organisation doing that, but it has some significant benefits. Oh yeah, so actually we'll just come on to this as well from Joe, the different organisations. So don't forget it's part of managing strategic implementation actually, rather than culture. It's the next bit after culture. But often businesses have organisational structures that may or may not get in the way of that helping the business do what it needs to do. So the organisational structures that are in the specification cover things like functional, which is the classic organisational structure. So a marketing structure, HR, finance, operations. You can also have a regional structure where the organisation is split into different locations, UK, Europe, Asia, whatever. You can also have what's known as a matrix structure, which is by function as well as by region, in which case you might have marketing in Europe and finance in Asia, and the matrix structure tries to manage each of those regions and functions at the same time. So those are the three main organizational structures in terms of implementing strategy. The other one is which is less common actually, is to have what's known as a product structure, which is organizing the business by product or product type or by business unit. But really those structures, I mean, I think it's less likely to come up because I think that's more about doing, in particular, obviously with regional structures, more about doing business internationally, which is an example of this year. But those are the main types of organizational structure. So there we go. Oh, well, Sean's asking, is Kaizen the opposite of entrepreneurship? Not really. I know what you mean. They are two different concepts, but they are closely linked. So Kaizen is trying to get the whole organisation to find better ways of doing things. Entrepreneurship is trying to encourage some members of the organisation, perhaps all the organisation, to be entrepreneurial. So in a way that they're not. It's not really the opposite. They're both trying to do the same thing. which is trying to encourage innovation, I would say. Priya's asking, are matrix structures examinable in the advanced information for paper 3? Yes, they are. Let me check. Pretty sure they are. 3.10.3. Yes, it is. Yeah, it is. A lesser known part of the specification, but could be. Right, should we do? Let's do Greiner's model of growth, or the Greiner model of growth. Greiner, because I think it does link to 3.10.4. So let's go over to a bit of Greiner. And lots of people have asked about this, so let's go do it. So if you're not bothered about Greiner's growth model, switch off now. Maybe come back later, or just hang around for a minute or two. It's on the screen there, but obviously you're not going to be asked to draw it. Thank goodness. However, it could be, as we did yesterday with Fitness Island, it could be that it's shoehorned into the case study in some way. Maybe the new leader has applied Greiner's model of growth and has decided that they've reached a crisis point and therefore wants to do something about it. But let's just explain what the model's about really, and how it might come up. It's not an easy model to understand, and that's why it tends to be examined as multiple choice questions, to be fair, because you can get away with a 1 marker on it. Essentially, the argument is this: that businesses that develop, either in terms of age as they get older, from young to old, and or businesses that develop from being very small to very large, they go through a series of phases of growth. And that's inevitable, isn't it? As a business changes, as it becomes bigger, as it has more people, as it has more products, as it trades in different markets, it's inevitable that businesses that grow and get older will go through phases of growth. And there are different phases there: creativity, direction, delegation, coordination. But what Greiner argued is that it's often the case that these phases lead to crises. And what they really meant was, you've got to do something about it. There's an issue with the business as a consequence of growth, and you've got to do something about it. So that's what we were trying to do with our Fitness Island case study yesterday, where we had Fitness Island set up by Jacques, couldn't let go, but needed to. He'd built a really big business very quickly, and it was obviously in trouble, obviously struggling, because he couldn't let go. A classic crisis of leadership, where the business needs to move from being reliant on one person and a founder to having more structure, more direction. So in other words, having managers, having more, eventually, control. That's not a crisis of control. It needed control. It needed direction. And that's what that situation was. So I think that's quite a likely situation in a paper 3 case study, a crisis of leadership, because you can link that really nicely to Handy's model, as somebody else has mentioned this morning. A power culture is often associated with young businesses, startup businesses where the founder is really influential. That is a classic crisis. The crisis of leadership, you need to move from being, do what you like, but the founder's in charge, to having proper processes in place, budgets, accounting systems, managers, all that kind of good stuff. In other words, a role culture. I think the other situation, which I think is most likely when it comes to paper 3, I mean, you can't rule out any of these crises, of course, but I would just spend a few minutes thinking about the crisis of red tape. So maybe over to you, just whilst I take a sip of water. What is the crisis of red tape? And in particular, what other model might we link it to, which is also examinable in 3.10.4? What do we think? Paul, I'll come on to you. It's a great question, how to relate organisational to the growth model. So I'll add that to my favourites now, and we'll go through that shortly. Yeah, so Ed's, let's stick a few of these on the screen there. Sarah's saying too much bureaucracy, too much paperwork, bureaucracy from Safa. Yeah, it's bureaucracy. Yeah, it's bureaucracy. Oh, fantastic from Josh as well. That's an even better response. The crisis of red tape, excessive rules, too many rules, too much bureaucracy. And a consequence of this, and a big consequence of this, is it prevents effective decision making. And it also is often associated with failing to scan and be on top of what's happening in the external environment. Therefore, it's very closely linked to the model of strategic drift, which of course is also examinable. So I would look out for that this afternoon. Who knows what the examiner is going to come up with, but if they're going to use Greiner, they're going to have to create a situation which is really obvious. It could be leadership. Business needs to be controlled better. It's out of control. But it could just as easily be, perhaps even more likely be, a business that is quite, maybe was a market leader, maybe was doing really well, but for whatever reason, the culture had become too bureaucratic, and as a consequence of growth, they've reached this crisis of red tape. Things aren't getting done. No innovation. Not responding to changes in the external environment. Losing market share to the competitors. Not taking decisions quickly enough. In other words, the classic situations of the likes of Blockbuster and Kodak and others that reached a crisis of red tape and also had strategically drifted from where they needed to be. So I think those two models, Greiner and strategic drift, worked really well together. Because what do you have to do? Well, you have to find a way of getting over that, don't you? You have to get into a growth mindset again. You have to get decision making working quicker, and you have to align your strategy with the external environment again. So I think the two of those two models work quite well together. So it could be in the context of crisis of red tape, too much bureaucracy, in which case I think Greiner. It could be strategic drift. I think the two work really well. As Nuala has mentioned in the live chat, absolutely strategic drift. So there we go. Hopefully that's useful. Greiner's model. Do we need to do anything else on Greiner's model of growth? Is that enough on that one? What do you think? Now's your chance. If you want to quickly ask another question on Greiner or Greiner. Adam's asking, what is bureaucracy, red tape? Well, it's rules and procedures. Let's say, for example, in order to make a decision about changing the price of a product, we have to have a meeting. Well, what's the point of that? Why not let a computer algorithm decide what the price is? Or why not let local stores decide what the price should be? Why do you need a meeting? Do you need to have a form that's filled in? It's all that kind of stuff. It's getting in the way. Bureaucracy is stuff that gets in the way of running a business properly. Hunter's asking, could you say that according to the Greiner's model, the crisis of red tape could lead to too much bureaucracy? Well, the crisis of red tape occurs because there is too much bureaucracy. That's this idea of too many roles, too many procedures, too many meetings, not enough action. So the crisis of red tape occurs because there's too much. Therefore, your challenge is to get rid of all the bureaucracy, if you can. So that's hopefully that answers that question, Hunt. Great question from Grace. Is it inevitable, and this is this is question 6 we asked last night, is it inevitable that all businesses will experience these crises? Well, absolutely not. No, it isn't. So in an open question like last night, you'd explain how and why certain businesses do experience them in the case of the case study business, maybe other situations. But I can think of, well, most well-run businesses don't go through these crises. They just grow, and they bring in new resources, and they develop their organizational structure, and they try to make sure that there's not too much bureaucracy, and they try to delegate where they can and decentralize where they can. And they're well run, often by bringing in new management as they go. So no, it's not inevitable that any of these crises will occur, I would say. That would be my answer to that question. Let's have a look. What else we got here? Yeah, the crisis of autonomy is where you have got control. You've got some direction in the business. However, the managers want more authority. They want more power. They want to be able to make decisions for themselves. They want to be more independent. So that's the crisis of autonomy. How much do you allow them to go and make their own decisions rather than having first put them into place? Then the crisis of control is, if you're not careful, they start making decisions that aren't in the interest of the business as a whole. In other words, how do you bring that back so that you haven't got lots of people making too many decisions around the business that work against each other? So that's the crisis of control, and what that needs is better coordination between business units, better coordination between management teams. There we go. It's a good question from SP. How would delayering solve red tape? Because delayering removes layers from the organisational hierarchy. Therefore, in theory, it speeds up decision making, doesn't it? In theory, there are fewer layers of the chain of command that need communicating with and through and to, and authority can be passed down the hierarchy as well. If the hierarchy is less tall, in theory, that speeds up decision making. Therefore, that reduces bureaucracy. Therefore, that reduces red tape. Mahesa is asking, can you link role culture with red tape? Absolutely, you can. You can definitely do that. So this great point. So an organisation that is a really strong role culture, where everyone knows their place, and there's rules and responsibilities in place, and the marketing department have very clear rules, and the HR department have very clear rules, that absolutely can create red tape, because they start creating their own bureaucracy, don't they? They start creating their own rules. So absolutely, you can link role culture, an excessively powerful role culture, with red tape. Too right, you can. Great question. Okay, right. I think that's good. I think we've done Greiner's model growth. We could spend all day on it. It's a relatively not minor. They're all important, but I just think look out for a crisis of leadership. Look out for a crisis of red tape. If something else comes up, don't worry about it. Just apply it, and you'll be all good. Somebody's asking, please, can we go over corporate governance or sources of finance? We can do both. So which would you like to do first? Corporate governance and network analysis, or sources of finance? You choose, please. No, I'll say move on. We've got an exam soon. I know it's coming up. Finance. A lot of people are saying source of finance. Actually, I'll say it's equal. Right, let's just deal with corporate governance first then. So let's just quickly deal with corporate governance, and then we'll move on to sources of finance, which I think is more likely. I think they're both likely, but I think sources of finance is really important today. So corporate governance, maybe help me out as well in the live chat if you can tell me what corporate governance is. I mean, I think I know what it is, but it'd be helpful to see in the live chat what it is. And I'll explain to you whilst you're typing that what it is. So corporate governance are rules and procedures that are designed to enable companies to be run properly. Why would you want that? Because there is the possibility that those in charge of the business, i.e. controlling the decisions of the business, do not operate or make decisions in the interests of those who own the business. And that is a thing called the potential for the divorce between ownership and control. And therefore, the divorce between ownership and control is basically the directors, the managers of a business taking decisions that they may find beneficial, they may believe is the interest of the business, but may not necessarily command the support of or be in the interest of the owners, i.e. the shareholders of the business. And therefore, what corporate governance tries to do, and it's mainly associated, in fact, it's almost entirely associated with public companies, where most shareholders are not involved in the day-to-day management of the business. Corporate governance tries to put in place controls, procedures. 2 or 3 examples, that's all you need to have. One is where the shareholders require the business, the board, to have what's known as non-executive directors. In other words, representatives of the shareholders who sit on the board of directors to see what they're getting up to. see what the decisions are, and report back to the shareholders. That's common. That's a requirement for all public limited companies in the UK. Another requirement is the requirement for the board to issue a report to the shareholders each year explaining what the business has done, the finances, as well as all the decisions, the key information. So financial reporting is another part of it. So that is what corporate governance is. That's all it is. It's just a means of trying to make sure that boards of directors act in the best interests of the shareholders. And that's it. That's it. That's basically it. That is corporate governance. How might it come up? Let's stick a few of these great responses here. Matt, that looks absolutely spot on, actually. Amazing. Corporate governance is the way that shareholders have rules to ensure that the board of directors make decisions in their best interest. That is the perfect definition of what corporate governance is. How could it come up? Well, it could be that the case study business, there's been some issues. There's maybe been some disagreements between stakeholders, for example, between shareholders and the board. Maybe the board haven't kept shareholders informed about what's going on. Maybe there's a disagreement about what the business is doing. In which case you could use stakeholder mapping, that model, to help explain why it's important for the business to communicate closely with the shareholders. It could be that an all-powerful founder or all-powerful CEO has basically been running the business to do whatever he or she likes. And that's not necessarily in the interests of the wider shareholder group. And that would raise issues of corporate governance, wouldn't it? And the divorce between ownership and control. So look out for that in the case study. Is there any evidence of it? In particular, any evidence of the divorce between ownership and control. Matt, that is an amazing definition. I absolutely love that. Well done. So what do we think? Does that help with corporate governance? What do you think? Let's move on then to, okay, let's do critical path analysis. Okay. Let's do that, and then we'll come on to sources of finance. Who's a critical path fan, and who's for whom is it a complete nightmare? Because it's a bit like Marmite's network analysis. You either love it or you hate it. And over the years, I've grown to love it. I started out hating it. And I've done network analysis from way back when I was training to be an accountant. So never really got to grips with it until a few years ago. You might argue, having seen me do videos on it and present it on cinema workshops, that I still haven't got to grips with it. But there we go. So it looks like most people are saying love it. Olivia, Joy, Rory's a fan, but Dansky, it's a nightmare. Hate it, says Elliot. Quite a few of you are in the hate it camp. Okay, so anyway, more importantly, how could it come up this afternoon? Don't forget, by the way, decision trees are not examinable this afternoon. And we know from QS, he says, hang on. We know from QS3, interpreting a range of standard graphical forms, it's not going to be a decision tree, so it could be a network diagram. It could be a break-even chart as well. You're not going to be asked to calculate break-even, because that's not in a QS. But you could be asked to interpret a break-even chart, I guess. But anyway, it could come up. How would it come up? Most likely situation is this, that the business has got a project in mind. It's got something important it's doing. It's used network analysis to plan that project. It's provided you in the appendices with a network diagram that shows the durations and the main activities. It will be it should be a completed diagram, I think. It'd be very unusual, I think, for you to be given an incomplete diagram, because there's no marks to be done. There's no calculations to be done in the paper. So most likely, I would say, very likely to be a completed network diagram, which is great. So that'll have all the nodes and the earliest start time, last finishing time, the durations and the activities all nicely listed for you. That's fine. But how are they going to use it? Well, they wouldn't give you a network diagram unless they intended you to interpret the diagram, and most importantly, to consider the implications of changes in the diagram, therefore the critical path. So we did this yesterday, didn't we, with Fitness Island? But just to recap, the classic question, not the only question, but the classic question is: there's the completed network. Let's say it's 15 weeks is the duration of the critical path. Let's say it's A, B, D, whatever it is. 15 weeks. All of a sudden, there is a delay, a problem. Something is going to delay one of the activities in the network. Either what is the implication of that for the business, or what could you do to mitigate or eliminate or change the impact of that delay on the business. Those are the two classic situations with a completed diagram. Typically, the examiner likes to choose an activity which has float, which then gets delayed. Why would you do that? Well, because it helps students differentiate themselves, because if you can work out an activity that has float, you should be able to see what the effect of a delay is on the total network time. So, for example, float is therefore one of the formulae that you need to remember, because you'll be able to calculate it and use it in your answer. Float is the last finishing time an activity can finish without delaying the project, less the duration of the project, less the earliest start time it could start. And let's say, the last finishing time is 10, the duration is 4, the earliest start time is 2. There's float of 4, isn't there? That activity could be delayed by 4. It could be 8 rather than 4, and that wouldn't delay the project any further. Yeah. So look out for activities that are not on the critical path, i.e. they have float, because don't forget the critical path is the longest path through the network, where none of the activities have any float. There's no spare capacity, no spare time. Look out for activities that have some float initially, but then get delayed. And the question is, what's the implication of that? Is it a delayed marketing campaign? Is it a delayed warehouse? Whatever it is, whatever the project is, could there be implications of that for the business? What are they? Or what could the business do to address that? And that's what we looked at yesterday in terms of network analysis. So I think, thank you. Fulton. Float says last finishing time, less duration, less early start time. That is quite an important formula to remember. So I would make sure that you've done that. Ed's asking, what's the difference between free float and total float? Well, total float is the total float throughout the diagram, throughout the network, isn't it? So it's all the float added together. Now, that is useful to know because it tells you where the total extra time or the total spare time is in the network. So, for example, you might have an activity that has float of, 3 weeks or 3 days. You might be able to transfer resources from that, let it go a little bit longer, and transfer those resources to one where there is no float, or where there's a possible delay. Free float is in the video where we went through question 2 yesterday on Fitness Island, where we had this launch of Yoga Mums, the new brand, and surprise, surprise, a big promotional campaign starting in November. Surprise, surprise, the product isn't going to arrive for 5 weeks, or 5 weeks later than expected. What are you going to do about it? That is the classic paper 3 network question. It's the one the examiner tends to like to ask. It's not the only way of asking it, but that's the way to do it. So what do you think? Is that okay? Good stuff. Right. Sources of finance or... Oh. Somebody's saying there's an issue with lag. I can't see any lag here. It could be just YouTube. The internet here is fine. Just refresh the page. We should be okay. What are we going to do? What do you want to do next? Do you want to do mergers and takeovers or sources of finance? Sources of finance it is. Okay. So, how are we doing? 10:30. There are actually some people doing the exam right now. And they're locked away in a room, aren't they, between 11:30 and 1 o'clock, whilst they get ready for a different exam. Right, so sources of finance. quick word about this. Ratio analysis. Financial ratios in relation to finance, so liquidity ratios, the current ratio, efficiency ratios, payables, receivables, inventory turnover, not examinable. That's in 3.7, not examinable this year in paper 3. We've had those earlier in paper 2, haven't we, in paper 1. So, however, sources of finance and gross profit and operating profit are examinable. So sources of finance feels to me like this is going to be a major topic area, and it could come up in a variety of ways, but I think one of the most likely scenarios would be that the business is experiencing cash flow difficulties. And we looked at this with Fitness Ireland. So and it links to concepts like over trading and poor management. So the classic question would be, how could you improve the cash flow of the business? But because we don't have the opportunity to calculate or interpret efficiency ratios like receivables days, like inventory control, inventory management, which are often associated with cash flow and working capital management, feels to me like it's more likely to be around what's the best way for a business to raise new finance, or what's the most appropriate way to raise new finance. Because don't forget, gearing isn't examinable either. So we can't sort of get into gearing ratios and efficiency ratios. So that's why yesterday I went through this classic question: should you raise new share capital, or should you take out a bigger bank loan? And which is the right decision? It could be a decision question. It could be which is the best way. Maybe they've done it. Do you think it was a good move? Or it could be it could be a 12-mark question. Analyze the benefits of using bank loan finance, or analyse the benefits of issuing new share capital. It could be something a little bit left field, like debt factoring. So in the live chat, please just help me out. I know what the answer is, to be fair, but what is debt factoring? What is debt factoring? What do we think? Debt factoring. Josh is on fire this morning. Debt factoring, the process of selling debts or receivables owed to a business to a financial institution. Superb stuff. Simran's got it as well. Selling receivables to a third party. So don't forget, receivables days isn't examinable, but debt factoring is. So it is linked. It's the sale of amounts owed to us by our customers in return for cash. Not the whole amount, because the debt factoring business take a slice, and then they are then responsible for collecting those debts. It becomes theirs. It's different from a thing called invoice discounting, where we basically get a loan with our sales, with our receivables as collateral. But debt factoring is one of the specific sources of finance mentioned in the specification. So I think raising new share capital, we dealt with that yesterday. The issues of it's the trade-off, isn't it, between lots of cash and a new investor. Maybe lots of new expertise, new shareholders, giving you the capital to take risks and grow. Lots of benefits of share capital if you can get it. But the downside is dilution of control for the existing shareholders. Bank loans, we should be pretty familiar with the upsides of those and the downsides in terms of, and you can bring in gearing, to be fair, as a relevant point. But the issue of interest payments, repaying the debt, but it doesn't dilute the shareholding. The other thing is just to be aware of is also, don't forget, retained profits is part of source of finance. And it could be that there is a decision to be taken about should the business use retained profits to finance a particular strategy. So you need to think about the advantages and disadvantages of retained profits. So retained profits are where you've earned a profit, but you've decided not to distribute it as a dividend to the shareholders. You've decided to keep the profit in the business. In other words, the cash, the profits stay in the business. Ice is asking, why would a company want to buy your debts? Because debt factoring businesses they specialize. Their core competence is in recovering debts. They know how to do it. They have systems and procedures in place, which means that they are very good at collecting debts, whereas a lot of businesses aren't, particularly in sectors like construction and building and distribution. You take your 80%, take your 90%, take the cash and let somebody else chase the customers for you. And debt factoring companies make a very large amount of profit each year by being very good at chasing debts. So that's the reason why. As Digger's pointing out, they gain a percentage of the receivables. They take a chunk. Stuart's come up with a really good contribution here around retained profits. I just think you need to be aware of this, and this is a really useful contribution. Retained profits effectively are free. They're not free because there's such a thing called an opportunity cost. The opportunity cost to the shareholders is not having the cash as a dividend. But anyway, to you and me, retained profits are free. They are also highly flexible. You decide what to do with them, unlike a bank loan. And the vast majority of businesses use retained profits as their main source of finance. Next most popular source of finance is a bank overdraft. So it is a very important source of finance. So don't, and therefore you can see that if a strategy can improve profits, for example, it may well be that the business wants to improve operating profit. That should also help improve cash flow, but it would also help improve retained profits, which of course is a source of finance. Good stuff. Hopefully that's dealt with. Anything else on sources of finance whilst we just pick off any final topics? Any other questions on sources of finance? By the way, many thanks to everyone who's helping each other out in the live chat. I would say 95% of the posts are very much around helping each other. 3% are about my hairstyle and 2% are about completely unrelated matters. But anything else about finance? Somebody's asked about debentures. Yeah, I don't remember. I need to check the specification, to be fair. I don't remember debentures featuring in the specification. If it did, I've not included it in my topic tracker. But anyway, a debenture is where a business issues a loan and gets cash in return for that. So it's a business issuing a loan rather than a bank issuing one. Shall we just do a few minutes on mergers and takeovers and synergies? Molly's one of several people asking about examples of mergers and takeovers, all that kind of good stuff. Let's just do a few minutes on that. So here we need to refer to section 3.10. Hang on. Let me get to the right part of this. Sorry, I've been scribbling on here after that question on ventures on M&S and Ocado. 3.9.1, assessing a change in scale. So whilst we look at that, maybe type into the live chat any questions you want to ask specifically about mergers and takeovers. Toby's saying we went through debentures at our school. Yeah, that's fine. I mean, it could well be on the spec. I mean, it's just not something I've ever listed separately on topic trackers. It's a source. It's a type of loan, except it's the business that issues the loan that gets the cash in. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's just another form of debt. And people asking about over trading as well, which is also part of the same part of mergers and takeovers. Now, we've already dealt with Greiner's model of growth, of course, and venture capital. Yeah. Okay, good stuff. Loads of questions coming in. Let's see if we can deal with some of these here. So, let me give you the 5-minute overview. Hopefully, that's useful. Don't forget, you've already had a question on external growth in paper 2. That's not to say it doesn't come up again. And as I've mentioned earlier this morning, one way in which external growth could come up is if there is a clash of organisational cultures. Maybe a takeover has taken place and there is a problem. Maybe one firm has a power culture, another firm has a role culture. You could even bring Hofstadter in. So it could be there is a situation that you need to address in the case study where, for example, a takeover has taken place, but the clash of organisational culture is making it hard to manage the two businesses, and in particular to achieve what's known as synergies. So just because it's turned up in paper 2 doesn't mean it can't turn up again in paper 3. So quick reminder. External growth is changing the scale of a business in ways other than organic or internal growth. So for example, a takeover, one business buys another. That could be horizontal integration, Sainsbury's buying Argos, one retailer buying another. It could be forwards vertical integration, so that could be a car manufacturer buying a car dealership. It could be backwards verticalization. It could be a pub business buying a brewery. It could be a retailer buying a wholesaler. So takeovers, mergers, which is when two businesses come together to form one big business, which is like a takeover, but it's called a merger. So a good example of that, the recent merger between Virgin Media and O2. It's now known as O2 Virgin Media. Great name. And then you've also got some other forms of external growth, such as ventures, as we had in paper 2, between strategic ventures or joint venture partnerships between the likes of M&S and Ocado. Every other type of change in scale is basically organic. So franchising is mentioned in the specification, but franchising is, it could be examined this afternoon, but it will be in the context of a business selling the right to franchise the format to other businesses. So it's not from the franchisee's point of view, it's from the franchisor's point of view. So franchising, often usually associated with service businesses, and organic growth. So that's when we're into new product development, entering new markets, all that kind of stuff. So the key concept to look out for with external growth in takeovers is this concept called synergy. There are two types of synergy: cost synergies and revenue synergies. Cost synergies, where cost savings arise as a consequence of putting two businesses together. For example, you only need one head office, so you close one down. For example, greater bargaining power with suppliers by being a bigger business. For example, redundancies, getting rid of people you don't need in the business you've just bought. Revenue synergies are where you achieve higher sales as a consequence of bringing two businesses together. For example, you might share each other's distribution channels. You might share each other's products on each other's websites. You might share each other's customers and sell your products to each other's customer list. Revenue synergies, where you increase sales as a consequence of a takeover. And so synergy, it could be the case that he's had a takeover. Maybe there's some information about the effect of synergies on profits. The question really with synergy is, have they achieved what they thought they were going to achieve? Is there some potential for more cost savings? Is there potential for revenue savings? That's the way I think that could come up. And that would be it in terms of mergers and takeovers, I think, to be honest with you. Unless you've got any more questions, I think. So, Charlie, let's pick up a couple of specific questions here. What's the difference between a merger and a synergy? Well, a merger explains what's happened as two businesses are brought together. Business A merges with business B and they become business C, a new business. That's the merger. Synergy is what happens when the merger's taking place. It's the actions that take place as a consequence of the merger. Can you cut costs? Can you increase? Revenues? So Bahemdi, I hope I've spelled that right, has asked an example of a synergy in a business. Well, a cost synergy, a classic example, cutting out a head office, closing down a head office, getting rid of a layer of management. So I often say to this, back in 2000, I was part of a very large merger between two well-known travel companies. I was in charge of 100 projects that were looking for synergy between our two. We had two airlines, two travel agents, thousands of hotels. But one of the project was, how do you create a synergy, a cost saving in the business development team? And I was a synergy. I got rid of myself, a cost saving. So there we go. That's what a synergy is. Hopefully that's answered that one. Dolly's asking, are cost synergies an example of economies of scope? Well, they're linked, but they're not quite the same thing, Dolly. But it's a good question. Cost synergies arise as a consequence of a takeover or a merger. Now, it could be that by putting two businesses together, you suddenly have a wider product range. Therefore, you might gain benefits of economies of scope. So in that situation, economies of scope can arise as a consequence of a takeover. Can do, can't it? So that an economy of scope could arise as a synergy arising from a takeover, but they're not quite the same thing, if you know what I mean. One could arise from the other. CW is saying, Jim, in exclamation marks, this was part of paper 2. Well, I know it was, because there's a joint venture question 16 marker, but that doesn't mean to say it can't be examined again. So it could do, and it's happened before. We've had the same topic area examined. What do we think? Any more questions about ventures or synergies or assessing a change in scale? Fred's saying, please can you explain economies of scope? I can. So economies of scope is similar to economies of scale, but different. So economies of scale, let's deal with that first, is where unit costs fall as total output rises. Simply a calculation. Total cost divided by total output is unit costs. That's what economies of scale are. Economies of scale, so economies of scope arise as unit costs fall because you are offering more products. You've got more activities, and certain fixed costs are therefore spread over more costs. So, for example, the best example of economies of scope is Amazon, isn't it? Amazon started out selling books. But as soon as Amazon started adding DVDs, consumer goods, groceries, food, and everything else in between, all of a sudden the costs of Amazon's platform, the e-commerce platform, all the systems, the warehouses, were being spread out over a much wider range of products and services, therefore reducing their unit costs for delivering each of those products and services. And that was a great example of economies of scope, because the scope of the business had been widened. So that would be an example there. Maz asking, would they mention about forward or backward? They could do. You might have to work it out. So if it's forward, that's forward in the supply chain. So let's say, I don't know, a manufacturer buying a retailer. If it's backwards, it might be a retailer buying a manufacturer. You just need to look at what the businesses are involved. But I wouldn't have thought they necessarily mentioned forward or backward or horizontal integration. They might want you to pick up on that and refer to it in your answer. Retrenchment is also in 3.9.1, and it's the opposite of mergers and takeovers, isn't it? Really, and organic growth. Sorry, I've got the wrong comment on the screen there. So Diogo is asking an example of retrenchment. Well, we did retrenchment in the revision blast. So a couple of examples of retrenchment: closing a factory, closing a business unit, perhaps a significant reduction in capacity or a significant reduction in staffing, large redundancy programs. It could also be closing a brand, stopping offering products, exiting an international market. Anything which is a significant reduction in the scale or scope of what you do is retrenchment. And the basic idea is to help the business cut costs, cut losses, but also focus on the things that they are best at. So with Fitness Island, we talked about the retrenchment, the possible closure of the underperforming retail stores. Julian saying delayering. Just let me check where delayering is in the spec. Can somebody remind me where it is in the spec? I know it's potentially in 2 or 3 parts, isn't it? But where was it specifically mentioned? Why have I not covered delayering? There must be a reason for it, which is there is a reason for it, because delayering is not examinable in paper 3. There we go. So yeah, don't forget change, managing change, Kotter and Schlesinger, Lewin's force field analysis, flexible organisations, not examinable. Don't need to worry about it. this afternoon, but you do need to worry about organisational culture. So hopefully that answers your question. We're just going to do a quick recap on a couple of things that we've been asked about earlier. Reasons for changing organisational culture. Well, poor performance, poor financial performance, top of the list. Secondly, new leadership. And it's hard to imagine a paper 3 that doesn't have new leadership arriving, wanting to change things. And I think the most likely situation is the new leader will want to change the organisational culture. So those are the two main reasons. We've done innovation, so hopefully we don't need to go through that again. One of the questions that could come up is the value of leadership in strategy implementation. So let's just spend a minute covering that. And also in the specification, it also talks about the value of communication in strategic implementation. I think that they're two sides of the same coin, but essentially what we're likely to have here is a situation where a strategic change is required, or the business is contemplating a change. So it could be the business is suffering from strategic drift, in which case it absolutely has to change. Or it could be that a new leader has said, no, we need to change direction. Not so much about strategic drift, but we need to have a change in direction. So the key there is just to sort of help explain to the examiner how new leadership can help with strategic implementation. And it's typically around bringing experience and skills that the business didn't currently have, maybe a fresh perspective on what's required. That's why often external leadership is often the choice of businesses that need a new strategy. Bring somebody in who's not associated with perhaps the failures or the culture of the past. And it could also be that new leadership gives you a mandate to change culture. Now, we haven't got change management, but we could refer to it. I know we're not going to get a question on change management, but we could refer about that, how new leadership is valuable in driving the required change in culture and the required change in other parts of the business as we implement strategy. So I think that is the most likely way that could come up. Ryan's saying, when you mention not examinable, what I mean is the advanced information refers to the topics that could be the focus of a question. So change management, Lewin's 5 forces model, for example, Kotter and Schlesinger, is not examinable. You're not going to get a question on Lewin, he says. Just checking. No, you're not. 3.10.1. But that's not to say that you couldn't use Lewin's 5 forces model, or not 5 forces, Lewin's force field analysis model to help support your argument. You can talk about driving forces and restraining forces. For example, organisational culture, trying to change culture, it's very hard. So you could argue that it's quite likely that trying to change organisational culture will result in resistance, which is a restraining force. So that's what I mean, Ryan. You're not going to get a question on it, but you could still use those concepts in your responses. Hopefully that answers that. What else do we think? Jim, can we do why strategies fail? We certainly can, which is 3.10.4, isn't it? Now, don't forget, we had a couple of questions in paper 1 about planned and emergent strategy and strategic drift, didn't it? Came up as a multiple choice. But these are the classic topics that could definitely reappear. Will reappear. 3.10.4 will be there this afternoon. So, because we know it's there, we have to anticipate a case study business where there is a problem with its existing strategy. Something is going wrong. Could be strategic drift, where the external environment has changed, but the business hasn't, and that might be related to culture. That's quite a likely scenario. It could be that the business doesn't have the right culture, doesn't have the right leadership, doesn't have the right resources, and it's young and inexperienced and it's grown too fast, so overtrading. So it could be that kind of situation. But those are the typical reasons why strategies fail. Either it's the wrong strategy because of what's happened in the external environment, that's strategic drift, or the business doesn't have the resources to implement strategy effectively. It doesn't have the right management. It doesn't have the right cash. It doesn't have the right resources, the leadership, and it needs to have better management. That's basically what it is. So that's why 3.10.4 touches on areas like corporate governance. It touches on areas like strategic drift. It touches on areas like the divorce between ownership and control, because those are reasons why strategies fail, because they're not supported. They're the wrong strategy. So that's therefore you can link that very closely, I think, to organizational culture, if you know what I mean. So hopefully that's dealt with. Prof's asking, can resistance to change come up? Not specifically, no, because that's part of managing change. However, reasons for and problems of changing organizational culture could. And one of the problems of changing organizational culture is resistance to change. So in that sense, it could come up, but not specifically Kotter and Schlesinger ways of overcoming resistance to change and types of organization, types of change. Okay, what do we think? And she's been very patient and said, please can we now do question 6? So let's do question 6. Maybe it's our last little piece here. People might be thinking, what the heck is question 6? It's not the question 6 this afternoon. It's question 6 from yesterday. So let me go find question 6. And it's actually quite a nice one to do, because it'll help us just recap the appropriate structure for paper question 6 this afternoon, the 24 marker. So let's read the question. Fitness Island, this is question 6. Fitness Island suffered a crisis of leadership when it grew quickly as a young business. Too right it did. To what extent is it inevitable that all fast-growing businesses will suffer such crises as they get bigger? So 24 marks. How do you answer that? Well, you answer it in exactly the same way as you did with the 16 markers. You deal with the case study first. That's why question 6 is still about the case study. I know it's an open question about all businesses, in this case all fast-growing businesses, but we have to deal with the case study first. So the answer why it was inevitable for Fitness Island is because it had the wrong culture. It had a power culture. It was run by a young, very talented but inexperienced young entrepreneur, Jacques with an S, who did not have in place the right resources, the right management, the right controls. And a consequence of that was, despite the early success of his online business, he then started making mistakes, and in particular the mistake around opening retail stores and entering into large rents, making losses, starting to spend the bank loan, starting to run out of cash. A consequence of growing too fast was that business inevitably was going to face the challenges, a crisis of leadership, where Jack had to let go. He needed to bring in new specialist managers to help run the business better. So that's how you deal with the first part. And if you wanted to, in a 24 marker, you could also bring in, if you wish to, some other examples of businesses that have grown too fast. I always remember, in fact, I got involved in a business called lastminute.com. I was looking at buying it on behalf of one of my former employees. This is back in 2000. I went to this business in 2000 in just around the back of Buckingham Palace. I've never seen a more chaotic business in my life. Unbelievably poorly managed, but incredibly successful. But I just knew it was going to crash, and it did in fact crash. It was rescued. However, a classic symptom: young startup businesses, fantastic energy, great creativity, but if they don't have the right controls, it's pretty likely that they're going to suffer, maybe overcome, but suffer a crisis of leadership. That's how we deal with the first part. And then what we then do with the open question is we turn it on its head, forget all about the case study business, and think about other situations where fast-growing businesses will not suffer a crisis or crises as they get bigger. Now, you've either got real-life examples of those, which I think is quite unlikely, or what you do is you make them up. You make it up. So you'd say, well, it's not inevitable, because a business may well have in place a culture and an organization that tries to be flexible as the business grows and is built around a role culture where you try to bring in specialist managers to address the growth and to help plan the growth. For example, introducing budgets and budgeting analysis, introducing accounting systems, having specialist marketing people, specialist finance people. They work together, they delegate where appropriate, and as the business grows, they delegate more, but they keep an eye on the delegation so that we don't lose control of the business. So you simply make it up and say, look, in those situations, a business that is well-resourced, has lots of cash, has good managers, maybe has good relationships between the directors and the shareholders, and they're getting advice. In those situations, it's not inevitable that you're going to suffer a crisis of leadership or any other crisis, because not every business suffers a crisis. So what I'm saying is you don't have to have specific examples. All you need to do is make a situation up that it helps explain why these crises wouldn't necessarily happen. And then we know that with open questions, the answer is always the same. In some situations, it will be the case. In some situations, it won't. And that's the answer. That's the conclusion. And then you explain how and why that's the case. So just picking up a couple of examples coming into the live chat in this one. So thanks for adding those in. RBS is a great example, actually. RBS is a great example of where new leadership suddenly created a crisis. Fred Goodwin, Sir Fred the Shred, as he was known, very aggressive in terms of not so much his personality, but his strategic approach. Tried to turn RBS into one of the world's biggest banks, did it through some seriously inappropriate takeovers, including ABN AMRO, I think from memory, and a number of others. Turned RBS into a disaster through external growth. And one of the reasons why he did that was because very, very weak corporate governance. So a great example of another business that would have inevitably faced a crisis as it grew. It wasn't a particularly young business, but it was a fast-growing business. So that's a great example of that. So thanks for that, Prof. It's also very, very good as an example of culture and organisational culture, in particular toxic culture, and the influence on leadership on strategy. It's a classic. Okay, so there we go. Well, fantastic. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Max is just Gymshark has culture problems from growing too quickly. Well, actually, Ben Francis has said that, hasn't he? I mean, I think Ben Francis is an amazing example of a young entrepreneur with his head screwed on, actually, in terms of how he's grown that business. But he has admitted that there were issues in terms of, trying to find people who are better than him at doing stuff. And that's always an issue for founders, how to make yourself dispensable. But great example. Gigi is saying, please notice me, otherwise I'll suffer strategic drift. Is that a question, Gigi, or just the fact that you're now being noticed? What do you think? I don't know. So hopefully that's dealt with that question 6 from yesterday. And hopefully maybe let me know in the live chat. That's how I would have tackled question 6. If you don't have real life examples, don't worry. You don't have to have them. Make them up. Just describe a situation. That's all you need to do. Thank you very much. Good. Let's just spend a couple of minutes just dealing with a couple of technique questions. Camo, along with others, have asked, what's the difference between 20 and 24? I can do the maths. It's 4. But there is a specific difference. He says, trying not to sound flippant. The 20-mark question doesn't have to be, but it's often a decision question. So it's often, have they made the right decision? What do you think? Or which is the best option for them to choose? So the 20 marker is often based around a decision. And we know that there is a decision question coming up because it's in the advanced information. That could be the 20 marker. It doesn't have to be, but it's often the 20 marker. So therefore, your evaluation has to focus on, was it a good decision or not, or which decision should they take, which option should they take. The 24 marker, it's the same structure in terms of approach, evaluation, peak and pies, but it's an open question. So the 24 marker, we need to consider not just the case of your business, but we also need to consider other businesses. So it's not so much a decision, it's the open question about all businesses or a business. Good question coming in. Another one from Harry. Good to see you again, Harry, by the way. I think we met, didn't we? At one of the, I'm sure we met at one of the cinema workshops. Absolutely sure we did. I remember it. Harry says, do we have to stick to the case study business, or is it similar to paper 2 where we draw on other business examples? Great question. So questions 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, only concern yourself with the case study business, nothing else. That's why you're given a case study. It's a case study paper. Just focus on the case study business. Question 6, case study business plus other situations, because it's an open question. But questions 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, case study business. So therefore you need to be thinking, when you see the case study, think, oh, such as seasoning, I might be able to use this more than once in my answers to help provide application. So a related question that's coming from Josh, can you use the same data in different questions? Absolutely you can. You can use the same application in different questions, but only if it's relevant. But absolutely, that's why it's worth doing the 12-mark questions first, because by the time you've dipped in and out of the case study a few times during the exam, by the time you come to question 5 and question 6, you're pretty familiar with it, and you can maybe repurpose, recycle some elements of the application you've used, maybe even recycle some of your such as seasoning in your answers. Adrian's asking, what calculations are coming up? Well, we're not expecting any calculation questions, because if there were, there'd be some 2 and 4 markers. However, we're expecting financial or other quantitative data to be provided in the appendices and also in the text of the case study, and we're expecting to be invited to interpret that data, manipulate the data, possibly draw some information from charts or tables, or, God forbid, a network analysis chart. So those are the calculations. For example, you might be able to use a percentage change, or you might be invited to consider a profitability ratio or whatever. So I think hopefully that answers your question. I think we've got a few more minutes before I let you go. We are almost done with this session, I think. Kieran's asked us a question on 12 markers. Is it always 2 points, or can it be 1 point? Well, it can be 1 point. There was a question in 2021 that asked you to analyse the effect of something or analyse the impact. So look out for that. If it's singular, you can just write 1 well-developed point. You can write 2 if you wish. But don't get bogged down in the 12 markers. But most of the time, not always, but most of the time, the 12 markers are plural. Most of the time. But they don't have to be. So look out for that. The 12 markers aren't there to give you problems, to create problems down the line. They're there to encourage you to get into the case study, start answering questions. So hopefully they're going to be okay. Tom's asking, what's the difference between a 12 and a 6 mark question? Well, you can help me out in the live chat here. There is one fundamental difference, isn't there, between 12 and 16 marks, which is evaluation. There's no evaluation in the 12 marker. 16 marks and above, we need a justified conclusion. Ben's asking, should we answer the 20 markers first? Well, you can if you wish. You can answer the questions in any order you wish. Let me just move that so I can get that question nicely on the screen from Ben. I can't think of a good reason why you do that. I really can't. Other than just you think you're going to run out of time, therefore you might as well deal with the bigger questions first. The more you get into the case study, the more you'll be able to find it easier to write answers, and you're better off being more familiar with the case study when it comes to answering question 5 and question 6 and question 4 than you are in the 12 marker. So I would answer them in the order in which they're presented, but it's entirely up to you. They get marked, the questions get marked by different people, so I wouldn't worry about it too much. Zane is asking, can the 12 markers be positive and negative? Could be, couldn't they? They could be the impacts or the effects, which could be either positive or negative. Yeah, absolutely could be. So you just need to unpick the question. Joe's asking, what are the chances of us needing to interpret a break-even chart? Well, it's possible, isn't it? It's possible. Could be given a break-even chart. We know we won't be asked to calculate break-even, but we could be asked to draw some inference from a chart. So it could be a break-even chart. It's possible. So just look out for the line where total revenue equals total costs, because that gives you your break-even output. And then we just need to work out what the output is to tell you whether or not they are operating in profitable, i.e. with a positive margin of safety, or loss-making, a negative margin of safety. Question, what models do we need to know for this paper? Well, I've listed them out here. I won't stick them on screen. I'll just take you through them. You need to know, potentially, or not need to know. Might not turn up, but you need to know them. Boston Matrix, no Ansoff Matrix today. Market mapping, segmentation in marketing, and the extended marketing mix. In culture, we need to know Hofstadter and Handy. Product lifecycle as well, so I forgot to mention that in marketing. We need to know the stuff in 3.10.1, so economies of scale, diseconomies of scale, the experience curve, economies of scope, strategic drift, and Greiner. And don't forget, going back to stakeholders, stakeholder mapping. I don't know why that particular question appeared on the screen there. Ryan is asking, how big do our chains analysis need to be? Long enough to answer the question. So there's no rule like there is in EdXL GCSE business where there's, a minimum of 5 strands. As long as your argument has a logic to it, a cause and effect, a how and a why, and is in context, 2 or 3 chains is absolutely fine, as long as you get from your start to the end point. It's more important to explain how and why something happens using the case study than it is to worry about 5 connectives in a chain of analysis. So don't worry about your analysis. Your analysis, I think, will be fine. Much more important is to use the application as much as possible. Evie's asking, do you write a conclusion of 12 markers? Well, I think we know the answer to that one. No. Why not? Because there's no evaluation in the 12 marker. So don't evaluate. Don't write a conclusion if you don't need to. It's just wasting time. Sam's asking, what's the difference between a 16 and a 20 marker? And I'll try to avoid saying 4 marks, but it is 4 marks. Same structure, 2 paragraphs. So you've got balance, arguing for and against, and then a judgment, a conclusion that's built on your analysis. Joseph, we've got literally 2 minutes to have a look at that. I'll have a quick look at that. Let's do that. Jim, question 1, please. This is just quickly going back to last night's Fitness Island, Love Island inspired case study. Here was question 1. Analyse the ways that changing organisational culture could improve the financial position of Fitness Island, 12 marks. So we needed two ways. So one way is by moving to a role culture, the business will employ more specialist managers who can impose better control over costs. That's one way. So, for example, I would then explain how, for example, by employing specialist financial managers who would implement proper accounting systems and budgeting systems, investigating variances, that would have enabled or would enable Island Fitness to tackle the adverse cost variances that the case study mentioned, a consequence of which should be better control over costs, which should therefore lead to improved financial performance. Another way in which changing culture could improve the position of Fitness Island would be to avoid the problems of overtrading. By moving to a role culture, the chances are that you're going to employ more specialist people who can understand the risks that are being taken by changing strategy. For example, if Jacques with an S had people who really understood retail and we had expertise in growing retail businesses, they perhaps wouldn't have opened as many new stores in prime locations with high rents as they did, thereby reducing the losses from those retail stores, perhaps opening retail stores slower to see how well they performed rather than expanding too quickly and suffering from overtrading. That would have also improved the financial position of Fitness Island. So I've still got Gigi's comment on the screen there. That's how I would have answered that question. Does that help? Question 1. Don't know why that comment didn't follow me to that explanation, but maybe it's not using the software properly. Ben's asking, what are the chances that overtrading could come up? It could do, couldn't it? It could do. Because we know that sources of finance and cash flow are likely to be, no guarantees, but likely to be a focus of the case study. So I wouldn't be surprised to see a business that's maybe got some cash flow problems, might need some new finance. The cash flow problems could be, no guarantee, but they could be a consequence of overtrading. So overtrading is when you grow too fast. Classic example is opening too many stores, or opening too many factories, or launching too many products, or spending too much on promotion, and you've not got the resources to be able to support that. So it could come up as a feature of the case study, but it doesn't have to. Doesn't have to. Harry's saying, for 12 marker, would you say about a page with smaller handwriting? Yeah, that feels about right, doesn't it? Yeah, two well-developed points. You might be able to get away with one well-developed point, depending on the question. But yeah, that feels about right. Don't forget, there's no evaluation. So, yep, you're welcome, Ben. No problem at all. That's answered your question. Hopefully, Time was asking for a definition of overtrading. Overtrading is where a business grows too fast for its resources. And typically that means that it runs out of cash and could fail. So normally it means overtrading is associated with rapid growth in sales, but a decline in profit and a decline in cash outflows. So it's typically associated with businesses with cash outflows, high fixed costs as well. So that's what we mean by overtrading. I think we've literally got 2 more minutes before I make some final comments. Great, another great question. Great to see you again, by the way, Stephen. Thanks for joining me last night. What questions should we use an introduction? Well, you don't have to use an introduction in any of them. I will definitely not use it in the 12 markers because it's not needed. But the introduction is this idea of setting the examiner on a journey of direction, intent. So it's an evaluation technique, isn't it? So it's a sentence that says, here's roughly where I'm going to go with my evaluation. Let's get on to arguing the first point. So I would typically use this in I might think about the 16 marker, so you don't have to. I would normally add a line in at the 16 marker, but definitely for the 20 marker and the 24 marker, I think it's a good technique to use if you're used to doing it. I wouldn't worry about it though if you're not. Don't worry about it if you've not got used to doing that. Will's asking, are 24 markers not intro 3 paras? 24 markers could be 3 paras and a conclusion. It could be. I think the efficient structure is an intro, 1 paragraph dealing with the case study business, 1 paragraph dealing with other situations, and then a nicely, really well-developed conclusion. That will get you the marks. If you wish, you can add a 3rd paragraph. But the danger with adding too many paragraphs is that you reduce the overall effect of your answer if each of those is not to the same depth. So, yeah, no one's asking about 20 and 24 marker. It is basically the same structure, but the 2 questions are slightly different. The 20 marker is usually a decision question. Should they do it or not? Or which one should they do? Or was it a good decision? The 24 marker is an open question. So it's the same structure, but your conclusion is slightly different, isn't it, in terms of the evaluation? Joe's saying, how does overtrading lead to an increase? Actually, overtrading doesn't. I know where that's come from. That's an error on one of my old study notes. Overtrading tends to lead. Well, actually, no, it can. It can lead to an increase in the current ratio if it's associated with a build-up of inventories, excess inventories. It can do, but often it's associated with a build-up of trade payables, which can lead to a decrease in the current ratio. But don't worry about the current ratio because it's not examinable this afternoon. Opinion on Harry Duke. Most people don't know what that is or who Harry Duke is, but I know Harry Duke very, very well because my son plays cricket with Harry Duke, and I've known Harry since he was 10. Absolutely fantastic cricketer, along with Matt Revis and a number of the Yorkshire cricket lads. He will be an England wicketkeeper. I have absolutely no doubt about that. He's a terrific cricketer. Anyway, that's cricket. So let's move on to paper 3. Right, I think we're done. Thanks very much. What I'm going to do now is I'm obviously going to sign off. We said we'd do 2 hours, and it's 2 hours coming up in a couple of minutes. So let me get something else lined up for you. Firstly, let's just quickly remind ourselves of what we need to focus on this afternoon. I know it's repeating what we said right before the start, but don't forget, even though it's 6 written answers, there's no MCQs or short questions, all that kind of stuff. At the end of the day, these are answers. These are just combinations of paragraphs and conclusions that you put together. So don't think of them as essays. They're just responses. The less you write, the more you focus on the demands of the question, the better you'll do. That will also help you tackle time. So don't get bogged down in the 12 markers. If you find yourself struggling a bit with one of them, move on. Don't worry about it. There's many more marks to be gained in the 16, 20 and 24 markers. But I do emphasize this need to be brave with the case study, to use the case study as often as you can. But don't just write it out and don't just repeat what's in there, because that's called writing out the case study. Try to use the information, use the context, the situation, link data, manipulate data, refer to an appendix. The more you do that, the better your responses will be, because your analysis doesn't have to be amazing. It just has to be reasonably good, doesn't it? But it's the application that raises the quality of your analysis, and also helps you come to well-supported judgments. So 4 questions, questions 3, 4, 5 and 6. Make sure you leave enough time to write at least a conclusion for each of those, please. Don't leave any of those questions 3, 4, 5 and 6 without a decent attempt at a conclusion. That's really important. That is the best way. Paper 3 tends to be the lowest scoring paper for obvious reasons. People are tired. There are fewer easy marks in terms of calculations, but students who give each question a really good go tend to do really well, particularly if they think application. Right, look, that's it. We're done. You've got an hour or two before paper 3. A couple of things from me. First of all, a huge thanks. I've spotted lots of familiar faces in today's live stream who've been with us today, yesterday, the day before, paper 2, paper 1. Some of you have been with us since year 10. So I know I speak on behalf of Graham and Vanessa and Kat and Mike and all the rest of the team who've helped me support the AQA A-level students this year. We can't wait for you to finish this exam and for you to get freedom, which is your summer back, and not have to worry about preparing for exams. We wish you all the best in paper 3. It will go well. If you found it useful and you want other people to discover, other victims to discover this video later down the line, give this a thumbs up on YouTube, and that will trick or fool the YouTube algorithm into suggesting this to AQA students for decades to come. Your gift to them as you depart AQA level business. I really do wish you all the best this afternoon. Go well. Try to keep to time. Use the case study as much as you can. And also, let us know how you get on. Maybe later in August, if you get the results you're looking for. Maybe if you do better than you're expecting. Let us know. And we'll be delighted to hear about your success. And also for all your mates who are taking the challenge of this afternoon's exam as well. I'll keep an eye on the comments section on this stream, see if there's any particular questions that you feel as though you haven't been answered. Try to answer those if I can. But for now, I'll sign off and wish you all the best and good luck.